Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jennifer Chrysler. I'm the Chief Advancement Officer here at Hampshire College, and I'm really delighted to welcome you all to today's really special event. I have to say, while we were waiting for people to come into the webinar, I was looking at some of the names on the participant list, and I noticed that we have somebody with the last name of Wolf and somebody with the name The Dog Father. So I think we're in for a really great time together. I'm so pleased to welcome you to today's event and to welcome Kathryn Lord as our speaker and Hampshire professor Cindy Gill as our moderator. This is a really exciting time at Hampshire as we celebrate our 50th anniversary and reflect on the profound impact of our graduates and the faculty who have influenced them. And of course, I would be really remiss today if I didn't mention Ray and Lorna Coppinger as shining examples of faculty who have made a difference for so many Hampshire alums and who have contributed significantly to dog research internationally and wildlife conservation. I want to thank all of you who are here with us today who have made gifts in their honor in the past, and I hope you'll continue to support Hampshire as we make progress on our Change in the Making campaign, a $60 million fundraising effort to ensure Hampshire's independence and vibrancy for the next 50 years and more. At Hampshire, students learn to explore their passions, to ask important questions, to bring together people to build community in support of a vision. And we are optimistically looking forward to what the next 50 years of Hampshire story will inspire. As we begin our conversation this afternoon, I want to leave you with a quote from our president, Ed Wingenbach, that I think captures the spirit of Hampshire so beautifully. He says, there are thousands of colleges and universities in the United States, but only one is entirely unconstrained by the assumptions of the past. Only one has as its goal to invent the future of the liberal arts. Only one has as its mission the transformation of all the others. That's what we aspire to do. I'm so glad you are here with us to be a part of that vision and mission. And now I will turn the Zoom over to Karen Sullivan, our Associate Director for Alumni and Family Relations. And thank you all for being here.
Thanks, Jen. On behalf of Alumni and Family Relations, welcome. I'm Karen Sullivan, a Fall 90 alum. And I've been looking forward to this event all year. We started planning it probably 9 months ago. I'd like to introduce Cindy Gill. Cindy is an associate professor of physiology at Hampshire, and she teaches courses such as human biology, animal physiology, and the science of stress. After this year, I have questions about that course. Cindy, I will turn it over to you to introduce Kathryn.
Hi, sorry, I giggled. Yes, I'm Cindy Gill. I'm a faculty member at Hampshire College right now. And it's my pleasure to introduce Kathryn Lord. Kathryn is a Fall 96 Hampshire alum. At Hampshire, her concentration was in biology with a focus on zoology. She went on to get her Ph.D. at the University of Massachusetts Amherst in the Department of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology. After several years of being a visiting professor at a variety of colleges, including Canisius College, Gettysburg College, and Hampshire College, she took up her current position as a postdoctoral associate in the Carlson Lab at the University of Massachusetts Medical School and the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard. And Kathryn's not going to talk about the research she and I are doing together. We're collaborating on some research looking at the development of the stress response in dogs and wolves. And I'll make Kathryn giggle by telling her something I don't think I've said to her. Kathryn sends me samples of urine and I measure stress hormone in them. And I'm supposed to be blind to whether it's dog or wolf and which individual. I pop open a tube of urine from a dog and I'm like, okay. I pop open a tube of urine from a wolf and whew, the musk smell is overpowering. So that's been fun for me. I'm not exactly blind to who's in what tube, but anyway, It's been fun to work with Kathryn, and I am going to turn it over to Dr. Kathryn Lord.
Thanks, Indy. That's really interesting. They smell muskier too. So I'm just going to share my screen here. Okay. So thank you all for coming today. I'm going to be talking about basically two messages today. One is about my research on evolution and development of social behavior in dogs. But since this is the 50th celebration of Hampshire, I wanted to tie this work back to, of course, my work at Hampshire. And so I wanted to kind of do a historical view of one of the projects I'm working on now. And when I started doing the prep for this talk, I realized that it's really easy to make it sound like I had a very straight career trajectory from this little kid who was super interested in animals and science from a young age to what I'm doing now. But that really is not the case. And I think this is probably true for most people, that the career trajectory I've taken has been much more complicated. And I think it does a disservice to students going in to look for their careers, thinking that there's this one really straight path, and if you take the right courses, you'll go in the right direction and get the exact right thing. When really it's all of these complex interactions and this variety of experience that you gain that get you to where you want to go. And in fact, I think you'll see by the end of this, I couldn't be doing what I'm doing now if I hadn't had all this large variety of experience. So I'm just going to follow one of these little twisty lines because we have 35 minutes, but I wanted to mention that. So I started at Hampshire back in fall of '96. And when I got there, I thought I wanted to be a marine biologist. It was the 90s. I was interested in animals and science. A lot of people were into marine biology. But my very first semester, I took a course in animal behavior with Raymond Coppinger. And this kind of changed my entire trajectory. This picture might seem a little weird to some of you. For those of you who took this course, this will look very familiar. I was trying to find a picture of Franklin Patterson Hall without the furniture in the East Lecture Wing, but I couldn't find one. So I have this picture, which is of the paper that we had to do our midterm exam on. So anybody who took animal behavior with Ray knows this Duncan and Shepherd paper. So one of the things that I got really interested in from this class was the idea of the development and evolution of behavior. And we learned about a lot of things, but one of them was the primary critical period of socialization. And this is a time period early in the life of mammals and birds when the brain is growing very rapidly. This picture is also from a lecture that Ray gave, which I think this picture also ended up in the book that he and Lorna wrote. So their brains are growing really rapidly. And because of that, the environment ends up having a really big impact on their behavior later in life. So what they experience during this time becomes super important. Things like anything they experience during this time becomes permanently familiar to them, even as adults. This is when they develop something called flight distance, which is how close you let something novel and scary approach you before you start to run away, and then also how far you run. It is also when they develop species recognition. So how a wolf knows it's a wolf or a dog knows it's a dog. It's also when they develop social bonds. So things like your dog bonding to you or a wolf bonding to its family members. And finally, it's a time period when the building blocks of complex adult behavior start to appear and sort of start to link up into the basis of what will become those complex adult behaviors. So there's all sorts of really complicated stuff happening here. And it's all really influenced by the environment, but there's also a genetic component. So this primary critical period of socialization can also evolve and change between species. And I just found that combination of genetics and environment to just be fascinating. And I ended up going on to do a Division I project with Dr. Coppinger on the development of hunting behavior in baby kestrels during a critical period, and kind of using this information to think about that. And I had all of this in my head when I went off to do an internship at the New England Wildlife Center, which is a hospital that takes in wild animals. And one of the things I noticed was that A, it's a really stressful place for wild animals to be. And B, we took in a lot of baby animals, and they had to learn how to be adult wild animals in that captive environment. And I became very interested in how do you produce an environment that allows an animal to act normally like it would in the wild, and also to develop those normal adult behaviors in captivity. And this question continued along with me until my Division III. And at that point, Ray was actually on sabbatical writing his book Dogs with Lorna. And I went up to Mark Feinstein and said, I'm really interested in this whole development and evolution of behavior thing, and really interested in enriching environments. Any ideas? And he said, well, we have these New Guinea singing dogs on campus. This is a picture of one of them. For those of you who knew them, this is Simone. And he said, you could enrich their environments. There's literature that says that they climb in the wild in New Guinea, and they don't have any climbing structures, so you could work with them. And I thought, great. So I spent that entire summer between my 3rd and 4th year working with our group of our little population of New Guinea singing dogs, walking them every day as far as they wanted in the Hampshire woods. I got completely lost most of the time, and they brought me back to their kennels when they got thirsty, cleaning their enclosures, getting them up to date on their vet records, just really getting to know these animals, which was quite an education. And then in the fall, Ray came back from his sabbatical, and I went and met with him and told him my plan. And he said, they don't climb. If they climbed, they'd be climbing out of that enclosure every night like the foxes we used to have. This is not what you want to do. You're interested in something called restoration ecology. And what you want to do is work with guide dogs. And so I did. And the idea was that the guide dogs are actually going through the very same experience that those young wild animals were that were being raised in captivity and then released into a wild environment. But in the case of the guide dogs, they're being raised in kennels and then being expected to do really complicated jobs out in complex environments like New York City. And it turns out that only about 50% of the dogs were succeeding and becoming guide dogs. And he thought that this might be because of this primary critical period of socialization that I mentioned. So it turned out we already knew a lot about the primary critical period of socialization in dogs. And it actually starts in dogs at 4 weeks of age, when they start to be able to walk and explore their environment. And then over the next 4 weeks, fear gradually increases. At 4 weeks, they aren't frightened of anything. They'll walk up to anything. Godzilla, they don't care. They'll walk right up to it. 5 weeks, they get a little more frightened. 6 weeks, a little bit more. 7 weeks, a bit more. And by 8 weeks, they actually will not approach something that is truly and completely novel, but instead they'll run away. And this brings the critical period to a close. So in dogs, the primary critical period of socialization is 4 weeks long, from 4 to 8 weeks of age. This is important because in guide dogs, it turns out what they do is to get them used to this complicated environment, they take them out of the kennels and put them in homes with people, but they do this at 8 weeks. So that's after this really important developmental period. And so we thought that maybe if I could create something to put into the kennels when they were younger, during this time when environment's really important to their developing brain, it would help improve the success rate of the guide dog puppies. So I went and looked in the literature and found out that one of the reasons they failed a lot was because they were scared of stairs and street grates. You'll notice Simone popped up there again. We took this picture. Kylene Lee, who is S2000, took this picture, and she usually, this New Guinea singing dog was a little scared of the stairs, and we were hoping to get a picture of her to illustrate being scared of stairs. But one of us accidentally kicked a bottle at the bottom of the stairs, so she looks really scared of the stairs. But that was the whole point of that picture, and the only picture I have of New Guinea singing dogs. I'm very bad at taking pictures while I'm doing research. But the guide dogs are also scared of stairs and street grates. So they'll go around them or balk and won't go up the stairs. And this is a problem. So what I did for my Division III was to create an enrichment device that could go in with the puppies and give them an experience with stairs so they wouldn't be scared of them when they grew up and were trying to become guide dogs. And so I spent a whole lot of time in the Lemelson Design Center. I learned how to weld and vacuum form. In fact, I think the majority of my Div III was in the Lemelson Center. And I created this device, which was you could change its organization. So on the top left, it was sort of a set of stairs laid down on the ground so the puppies could just kind of run over it. And there were also these below that, this vacuum formed set of street grates that the pups could kind of wobble over. And then this could all be put together and slowly raised up off the ground to become more and more like an actual set of stairs until you finally had proper stairs going up to street grates that were raised and the puppies could run all over them. At the same time, I did a review on all the literature and rewrote my Div III many times with coming back to me with red ink from Ray on content and blue ink from Lorna on grammar and style. And I learned a lot about writing my Division III. So I did all that. And then at the end, Ray suggested that I turn it into a grant proposal to a large guide dog institution to try to actually test and see if this would improve the guide dogs pups success rate. And so I did that and I got the grant and I ended up going and spending a couple of years with guide dog pups. I actually didn't test the stairs and street grates because when I got there, they had a lot less enrichment than I expected. So giving the street grates and the stairs ended up being a little more than they needed. It was kind of like giving them algebra and nobody had taught them how to count yet. So I tested a whole bunch of other stuff though, and found out a lot of things, which I can't get into in 35 minutes, but happy to answer questions about later. But I published all the findings in some white papers through Lemelson, and that is still available out there, still floating around. So, so that was amazing. And what that really ended up doing was showing me, besides being really exciting and interesting, ended up showing me that I really enjoyed this science thing. I really liked doing this and I wanted to keep going and go to grad school. So I applied to grad school and went to the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And Ray was my co-chair along with Melinda Novak. And when I went, again, I had an idea that I was going to work on kennel enrichment still, but now with shelter dogs. And while I did end up doing that project, that did not become part of my dissertation. I again shifted. And this was because I was also planning on adding in this evolution component and comparing dog and wolf puppies. And once I started raising wolf puppies, I realized I had more questions and that this model was really fantastic for exactly what I was interested in. And so I'm going to talk about one of those projects. So once I got in there and started raising wolf puppies, it was really amazing how different they were from dog puppies. And one of the really shocking things was how long it takes them to actually socialize, to form social bonds with humans. So dogs are amazing at forming social bonds with other species, including us. And they only need 90 minutes of exposure to humans to start soliciting attention from them. And that's not 90 minutes a day. That's 90 minutes total during that critical period between 4 and 8 weeks. And they will start to think people are cool things. It's not going to be a really great socialized dog. Usually we socialize them much more, so they're used to all kinds of people. But it really only takes 90 minutes for them to start thinking people are a good thing. Wolves, on the other hand, you have to start socializing them before 3 weeks, and you have to do it 24 hours a day. And you do that, that's sleeping with them, bottle feeding them, until around 4 to 6 weeks. It really depends. It's basically when you can't stand sleeping with them anymore because they bite. Mom wolves also leave the den at this age. And then you spend all waking hours with them until about 16 weeks of age, at which point they can go back and live with adult wolves in captivity, but they have to keep up human contact daily in order to keep this socialization going. And even after all of that, they don't act like dogs. They still are more fearful. They still show hunting behavior that can be quite dangerous. So they're very different from dogs, even after all of that. And so we think that this is because of a difference in the primary critical period of socialization. And I'd always learned that it was because of a difference in the length of the critical period. So wolves, unlike dogs, start to walk at 2 weeks of age, so 2 weeks earlier than the dogs. And I learned that they reached that end of that critical period, that they started to avoid novelty at 3 weeks of age, which would just give them 1 week for that primary critical period. But that didn't make a lot of sense to me because wolves are super social animals amongst themselves. And I did a little research and found out that wolf pups don't leave the den until 4 weeks of age. So you'd end up with a situation kind of like what we saw with the guide dogs, where the wolf pups would be learning everything, getting all of their experiences in a den, which is fairly, sterile compared to the rest of the world. They just have their siblings and mom in there. And they'd have to learn about the whole rest of the world afterwards. So that didn't seem right to me. So I went back and did some further research and found out that the actual avoidance of novelty in wolves doesn't happen until 6 weeks of age. What's happening at 3 weeks of age is actually the startle response, so the first appearance of fear. And the confusion was that for a long time, the end of the critical period was called the onset of fear. And in dogs, that was referring to what I told you, the avoidance of novelty. But in wolves, it got kind of misconstrued as the first appearance of fear, which is the startle response, which also happens in dogs at 3 weeks of age. But the avoidance of novelty, which brings the critical period to a close, doesn't happen until 6 weeks in wolves. And that leaves us with another problem, because that means that wolves have the same length critical period as dogs, but it's just shifted 2 weeks earlier. And that doesn't explain the behavioral differences at all. But when I was raising the wolf puppies, I came up with an idea. And this was because when I had been working with the seeing eye dogs, I started to learn that playing music to them was really important. And playing sounds, traffic noises, was important because it got them used to all those crazy sounds in the kennel. So when they were adults, they weren't scared of them. So I did the same thing with the wolves because that's what I've been doing with the dogs. But at 3 weeks, the wolves started to get scared of the sounds that I'd been playing for since they were 10 days old. And that was weird. So I thought that maybe the development of senses were a key to this. And so I tested the development of the senses in the wolves. They were already well known in the dogs. So basically I could use the dogs to confirm that the way I was testing the senses was correct. And what I found out was that dogs and wolves actually develop their senses at the same time. So they're both born with only the sense of touch, and they begin to smell the world around them at about 1 week of age. Then at around 2 weeks of age, their eyes open, but at this point, they're really just seeing light and shadow. They can't see properly yet. At 3 weeks, their ears open. That's that startle response, and they can hear okay, but they don't really start to reliably respond to sound until 4 weeks. And then at that same point, they're also showing what we call visually guided behavior. And that's where they see something at a distance and approach it. So their vision is actually kicking in. And the reason this is important is because in the dogs, this means that they get all of their senses online, so to speak. Then they begin to explore and have all these experiences during the critical period. So they get a full picture of the world. And what this means is that when they're adults, if something smells familiar or sounds familiar, or looks familiar, then it can be considered familiar and can be approached. But for the wolves, they're starting to explore, well, they're really blind and deaf, and they're just using their sense of smell. And so as they move through the critical period, they're adding in what things sound like. So they're pairing the sound and then they're pairing what it looks like, but they really only have 2 weeks to get used to the way things look and 3 weeks to get used to the way things sound and full 4 weeks to get used to the way things smell. So for an adult wolf, what it really comes down to is whether it smells familiar. And so this difference in the interaction between the senses and the critical period of socialization really explains those behavioral differences between the dogs and wolves. So I then went off and after I got my PhD, I went off and became a visiting professor at a number of places. Gettysburg on the left, where I did some work on barking with my students, and Hampshire on the right, where we did some of the work that Cindy was talking about with the dogs end of things, as well as some epigenetic stuff, lots of fun. And then I moved into my current position at UMass Medical School and the Broad and the Carlson Lab. And what I'm doing there, it's actually a bioinformatics lab, and I'm now trying to add in a genetic component. So can we figure out the genetic underpinnings to that little shift in timing? And the really cool thing about that little shift in timing is that historically it's been really hard to associate genes to behavior because there is no direct link between genes and behavior. Genes just basically express proteins, and to get from a protein to a behavior is a long trek. So historically, especially in the dog literature, and if anybody took any of Ray's classes, they know that the behavioral genetics work in dogs has been just really bad. It's just, saying they have genes for water loving or stuff like that. It's just not good. So the idea here is that we now have this small shift in timing, and can we actually, instead of looking for genes for behavior, can we find genes associated with this little shift in timing? Which is much closer to those proteins and has a big effect on behavior. So before I get into this, I want to tell you how we try to find associations between genes and traits. And so genes are made up of nucleotides, which we just represent as letters A, T, C, and G. And what we do to try to associate a gene to a trait is we get a population. In this example, it's Chihuahuas. And we get a population that varies in the trait of interest. So in this case, our trait of interest is coat color. And we get the genotypes, so the as many genes as possible from each of these animals, and try to look for single letter changes, which the fancy terminology for that is single nucleotide polymorphisms, which geneticists like to make everything short, so it's called SNPs. So we look for these one letter changes, or SNPs, that differ between the animals with the different traits. So it looks something like this. You have a bunch of Chihuahuas that are blonde and a bunch of Chihuahuas that are tricolored. Each Chihuahua gets genes from its mother and father. So we have two layers there of letters. And then we try to look for the place that the letters differ between the yellow-coated animals and the tricolored animals. And see if you can find it before I hit it. It's right here. So you see we have all T's there for the yellow-coated animals and all G's there for the tricolored animals. And so we'd say that that area is well associated with that trait. Now, it's important to realize that this is an association. And just because or a correlation, and as you may have heard, correlation does not equal causation. So this is not enough to say that this gene actually causes coat color. We'd have to then go on and do experiments to make sure that that was the case, but it's the first step. So it turns out that this works really well with morphology, but it's rougher with behavior, again, because there's such a big jump between the genes and the behavior. So instead, we're focusing in on this little shift in timing. And this kind of study is called a genome-wide association study. Now, people have done genome-wide association studies between dogs and wolves before, but there's a problem with this. The first problem is that dogs and wolves are two different populations, not a single population. And so what ends up happening is that even though dogs and wolves are genetically pretty similar, they're similar enough to reproduce and have fertile offspring, they still have a lot of genetic differences. And they also have a lot of what we call phenotypic differences. So those are actually the traits you can see, whether behavior or morphology. So we have all those behavioral differences that I already mentioned, plus we have a lot of morphological differences like coat color or ear shape or size, and all sorts of things going on. So what we end up with is a whole bunch of genes that differ and a whole bunch of traits that differ, and we can't really figure out which gene goes to which trait. And so it's a bit messy. So what we're doing instead is looking at wolf-dog hybrids. And so the neat thing about hybrids is that after the first generation, once they start breeding, mom gives some genes to the baby and dad gives some genes to the baby. But the cool thing is that when they do that, there can be some recombination. So they don't have to just give genes from their mother or their father. There's actually recombination between those genes. So when they pass them on, they're getting a mix of dog and wolf genes from their mom and a mix of dog and wolf genes from their dad, and getting some cool combination thereof. And so in any place along their genome, we have places where they have some genes from wolves and some genes from dogs. We call that heterozygous, and I'll be representing that sort of in the peach color in the next figure. Or they can get all genes from wolf, from both mom and dad. We call that homozygous wolf. Or they can get all genes from dog, and from both mom and dad, and we call that homozygous dog. So we end up with a bunch of animals who have a whole mix of possible combinations between wolf and dog. And we can look at animals who act more doggy on the top here. Our top 3 animals are acting more doggy, and animals who are acting more wolfy on the bottom. And again, try to look for that place where the genes are associated with the trait, but not just the genes, but also the ancestry. So we'd want them to be homozygous dog in the doggy acting animals and homozygous wolf in the wolf acting animals. And so by mixing both the genome-wide association study and what we call admixture studies, which are that hybrid aspect, we can do a genome-wide admixture study and get more information, hopefully. So that's what I'm doing now. We collected genetic data, from saliva and from fur. We did this with 100 animals, but we ended up getting 71 animals that had complete phenotypic data as well. We got morphology data, looking at things like fur color, and behavioral data. And so this looks a little intimidating, but don't be scared. Shirley, who's a graduate student in the Carlson lab, created something called a hidden Markov model to determine the local ancestry of all the animals. And that local ancestry is just what I talked about before, whether they're homozygous wolf, homozygous dog, or heterozygous in each place along the chromosome. And this model just looks at reference animals, so reference wolf genomes and reference dog genomes, as well as the recombination rate, so how often you're getting that mixing in the parents before they pass it on, and tries to determine where the animal goes, the most likely place the animal will go from a homozygous wolf state to a homozygous dog state or a heterozygous state, and creates these cool models. And so she simulated a whole bunch of hybrids from the reference genomes, up to 20 generations mixed, and tested her model and found out that it was accurate to a 96.3%, which we were very happy with. So we then went on to do, I'm not moving forward, there we go, a GWAS on the morphology, so that genome-wide association study in morphology, to make sure this was working. We had about 19 morphology traits, but about 6 of them had nice spread in, how different they were across our population. And we had some interesting findings. So again, don't be intimidated. This is called a Manhattan plot, because if it works, it looks like Manhattan. And basically along the bottom, you have the chromosome number. And then along the vertical axis, we have the statistical probability. So the chance that it would be associated. So if it's very high, then that's great. That if it's a very high dot, then that means it's very well associated. And each dot is one of those SNPs. So if a dot's very high up in the graph, that means that it was very well associated with our trait. And you can see there's one marked there in red, which is in the CBD103 gene. And that was really exciting because this trait was black coat color, and that particular gene had already been associated with black coat color in dogs and wolves. And even better, we then went into the admixture data. And so we have our Manhattan plot again on the top, but now on the bottom, we've added in our admixture data. Chromosome is still along the x-axis on the bottom, but now on our vertical axis, we have % homozygous wolf. So in the gray line, this is our non-black coat color animals, so animals who didn't have black coat color, and the red is animals who did have black coat color. And you see as we go along the chromosomes, they're both pretty close to each other until we get out towards that CBD103, and then suddenly you're much less likely to be homozygous wolf if you have the black coat color. And so that suggests that this black coat color gene is coming more from our dog population, and that's also what was previously found. So this kind of confirms that what we're doing is working and that the admixture information is helpful, giving us a bit more power. And the other trait I want to tell you about is tail carriage. And so tail carriage, when we started collecting it, we thought it was probably a morphological trait because that's how it's generally treated. But as we were collecting the data, I realized it's really a behavioral trait, because if you look at the side there, you'll see that wolves usually carry their tails down and straight, and dogs can often carry them up over their backs. But if you have a dog who carries its tail that way, you'll realize that they have the ability to put it down usually. And so they can actually change the carriage of their tail based on their internal state. And so we tried to collect the data when the animal was in a relaxed state. But when Shirley did the GWAS on this, the genome-wide association study, she didn't find anything significant. But when she looked at the top 50 most well-associated loci, she found a whole bunch of genes for autism. And that was really exciting for us, because it turns out that looking at differences in the early development of social behavior isn't just interesting for domestication, but people who study autism are also really interested in this developmental difference, because when they look for genes that are associated with autism, they've found hundreds of them, but they're all just associated with a small proportion of the population affected with the syndrome. And they think that that is because all of these genes are different ways of dysregulating the early development of social behavior. And while they don't call it that primary critical period of socialization in humans, it's the exact same thing. And so we were excited with that. So she went a bit further and did something called an enrichment analysis. And this just looks to see if we're seeing more genes associated with a certain thing, in this case autism, than we'd expect in the high associated loci. And it turns out when she looked just at the GWAS that it was higher than expected, but when she added in the admixture, it was significantly higher than expected. So we were seeing significantly more autism genes than we'd expected associated with this trait. So I don't have any data on this last bit, but for the last couple slides, I just wanted to tell you that we also collected behavioral data. So we looked at how the animals interacted with a familiar and novel object. So we placed a familiar object in their enclosure, a novel object in their enclosure, and then we paired the familiar with the novel object. And this is because dogs tend to not be terribly impressed with familiar things, vaguely interested in a novel thing. And if you pair it together, they basically think it's familiar again and are uninterested. Whereas wolves, while they're more neophobic, they're also way more interested in a familiar thing and super interested in a novel thing. And then they treat the familiar and novel object like it's even more novel. So we should be able to separate out their behavior. And this all goes back again to that shift in the primary critical period of socialization. And then we also looked at how they interacted with strangers. But we don't have any data for that, so you'll just have to hang on and see how that goes. Keep in touch. So in conclusion, by combining the ethological and genomic techniques along with the unique ancestry of wolf-dog hybrids, we think we can start to get some insight into the genetic underpinnings of behavioral differences that have evolved in dogs. But also there's no way I could have known, or anybody really could have imagined this study when I was at Hampshire. There wasn't the technology, didn't have the findings yet. So there's no way I could have predicted this direction. But without all the experiences I had at the beginning with Hampshire and Ray, I never would have gotten here. So I'd be happy to answer any questions that people have.
Hi, so I got kicked off of Zoom for a minute. That was, all right. Chelsea Chronic has a question. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between critical social period and classification period?
I'm not familiar with what classification period is, so I'm going to have her outline that a little bit more and get back to it.
Okay. Chelsea, you can put a definition in the Q&A if you want. So anybody that has questions, you can put it in the Q&A. I might look at the chat some, but okay, Lucy Schwartz has a question. Does your research indicate that dogs could experience autism? We have a special needs rescue German Shepherd who I have often thought may have autism.
Yeah, so this is something we've really tried to avoid in our research, saying that dogs or wolves are more autistic. So that's definitely not what we're saying. However, there is a lot of research looking at autism-like spectrum disorders in dogs, and especially with dogs who did not have much experience at all during the primary critical period of socialization. So an animal that was raised in a very sterile environment for the entire time, even beyond that, tend to show behaviors that are very similar to autism spectrum disorder in children, possibly because it's interrupting the same thing. It's basically like, no, you get no experience during this really important time. But I would like to reiterate that that is not what we're looking at in our study.
All right, a question from Paul Vrana. Are the GWAS loci associated with the autism-related genes in regulatory regions?
Yeah, so we haven't gotten, let me just see if I can back up here. It's a great question. Let me, there we go. Okay, so we haven't gotten super into looking at these specific genes. Most of the autism genes are in regulatory areas. I'm not sure about these very specific ones, what they know about them. A lot of times they don't know much about them. But yes, they tend to be, all the genes they tend to find in autism related to autism spectrum disorder are usually in regulatory areas. But what we're hoping is that our behavioral analysis will come up with a more specific list that we can then get into a bit more and see what the history of the information on that. Yeah, if we're lucky, people will know something about it. 90% of the time you go, that gene we know very little about, it's associated with autism and it's, possibly regulatory, but fingers crossed.
All right, a question from Robert Miller, and I know I skipped over a question. I think it maybe came in while I was booted off of Zoom, so I'll come back to that. Thanks, Sarah, for alerting me. Question from Robert Miller. Hi, Robert. I'm wondering why a lot of ancient breeds like Spitzes curl their tails, but a lot of more modern breeds like German Shepherds generally do not.
So there's two pieces to the answer there. One, ancient breed is a misnomer. So they look ancient because they've been separated for a long time from a lot of the European breeds. So when we look at them, they have a lot of genetic differences, which tends to make them look older. But we've looked more carefully since and realized that no, they're not in fact any older than any other. But there could be, that could also answer your question, is that they've been kind of separated out. So they may have slightly different genetic backgrounds, which, for founder effect or what have you, may lead to that sort of curly tail holding. I have not come to a conclusion as to exactly how to deal with curly tail because there's a lot of elements there. I mentioned it's probably behavioral, but there are some morphological elements in some breeds, like pugs have actual fused vertebrae. That's clearly more morphological. They can't move that. And there may be something with soft tissues in some of those, like Shiba Inus and stuff that hold them really high and curled, but nobody's ever looked at it. So we really don't know how to deal with that. So there's clearly a behavioral element. There's also sometimes a morphological element. So it's a bit of a mystery. It's something somebody needs to look into. A good scientific project.
All right, a question from Phoebe Carcos. Hi, Phoebe. I know a lot of these people. Has there been similar research done with behavioral variation between different breeds, especially with working breeds? I have also wondered if there is actually a big difference between working line bred dogs and dogs bred for show.
Huge difference between working line and dogs bred for show, and something we deal a lot with in other projects we're working on in the lab, trying to look at breed differences in behavior and such, and see if there really are breed differences in behavior. And I suspect that most of the breed differences in behavior are in those working lines and not in the show lines. But I was hoping somebody would ask this question, so I kind of just left this slide at the end. see if I can get, okay, yeah, there it is. So critical period stuff actually may vary between breeds, and these are working line dogs that I did this on at the Guide Dog Institution. So I told you that the critical period is between 4 and 8 weeks, but when I was at the Guide Dog Institute, I actually tested the development of fear, just the behavior, not as fancy as we're doing now with Cindy with the cortisol, which we're trying to get a little bit more data on it. But the initial data showed that the German Shepherds at 5 weeks had a lot more fear than we'd expect, suggesting that they were actually reaching the end of their critical period a bit earlier than you'd expect them to, than the average dog from previous literature, whereas the labs were showing like no fear at 5 weeks. So we thought that maybe they'd be experiencing the end of the critical period a bit later. And we found that the shepherds were failing for fear way more than the labs, which makes sense if you add in that when they go home element, because the labs had like a week in the home to get used to everything before the end of their critical period. And the German Shepherds were long over their critical period by that point. So there could be some interesting breed differences, but yes, the working dog element is very important.
Right. I'll add in, Kathryn and I were hoping to compare wolves and dogs, and what we found was wolves look like this, and dogs are incredibly variable. Domestic dogs are so variable.
Especially because we're using mixed breeds. They were all over the board.
Yeah. All right. So back to the initial question, it disappeared, but Chelsea Chronic asked earlier about some definitions in socialization. So they say in dog training and behavior, we typically talk about critical socialization ending around 16 weeks, but this incorporates a lot of time beyond that 8 weeks. I am just not really clear about where the research on this is coming from and what the distinction is.
Yes. This is a place people get confused a lot. And when I'm giving this talk to dog trainers, I actually include this information. So, just back this up so you can see the 4 weeks. So there's a lot of confusion about when the critical period of socialization is. And this is all because of John Paul Scott, who did all the work on this initially. And if you read all his papers, he can't decide. He puts a new date in every single paper he puts out. He's like, it's from 3 to 6. It's from 2 to 8. It's from 5 to 60. And so everybody got very confused. But if you read them carefully, what's going on is that if you leave the dogs alone and you don't influence them at all, this is the critical period of socialization. But if people get involved, we can extend it quite a bit. So back to 2 weeks, you can actually put stuff in the puppy's environment, like that sound I was talking about, giving puppies music and stuff before 4 weeks of age, because they can hear something. And it actually has a huge influence, but on their own, they wouldn't be getting that. I have to pipe that in. And then after 8 weeks, after they stop avoiding novelty, I can get them to approach things they normally wouldn't by adding an element of familiarity. So this will happen a lot of times when people do this by accident when they get puppies, because you get a new puppy, it's usually like 9-10 weeks old, and it might balk at something like the trash can outside the garage, has a flappy bag in it, and they go, oh God, that's terrifying. But they know you. And so if you touch that trash can, you've added an element of familiarity to it, and now they can go up and explore it. And they actually still have more plasticity than an adult dog all the way through 16 weeks. So that's where that 16 weeks comes in. This doesn't work so well after 16 weeks. They become an adult dog and you actually have to train them and habituate them to it. It's a whole different process. But all the way through 16 weeks, I can still have a really big effect on how their brain develops, but I have to add something in. So completely on their own, this is their critical period. With humans doing stuff, you can extend it out to 2 to 16 weeks.
All right. This is an earlier question. Did you use any wolf dog breeds for the wolf dog study? Sarloose wolf dogs or Czechoslovakian wolf dogs? I feel like they would be interesting to look at because unlike most wolf dogs, there is a much more selective breeding process by humans.
Yeah, this is very true. So if people aren't familiar with this, there are some breeds. I don't think any have been officially AKC-ified in the United States, but in other countries, they have been officially created into breeds that have some wolf in them. So we were getting all of our animals from sanctuary. Well, not all. We were getting most of our animals from sanctuaries, which are animals that were, put into the pet population and didn't work out for one reason or another. But we did have one small group that was purpose bred to look wolf-like and act more dog-like. It was not specifically from a wolf dog breed, but it was from a population that had been bred much like that for a while. And so we are interested in how those guys will shake out compared to the rest of them. But right now, no, we did not really use those for most part. It's just mixes, and happily there's quite a variety of percentage in there, everything from pure wolf to barely wolf and everything in between. So it worked out nicely.
A question from Ingrid Sweeney. You collaborated with Dorrit Feddersen-Peterson, who also has done research in this area, asking from Europe.
Have I collaborated? No, I have not collaborated with her. I have read a lot of her stuff, but I have not collaborated with her.
All right. A question from Marissa Perez. How similar or different are the capabilities of dogs and wolves to sniff and be able to have such a heightened ability to sniff what humans can't?
Yeah, so there's not a lot of research in wolves on this, and the stuff in dogs is actually fairly ongoing. In fact, one of the people I raised, who was a grad student at the time and helped me out raising wolf pups at one point, studies dog sniffing ability, and Nathan Hall. And so that stuff's actually ongoing, how good dogs are at it. We've been kind of blasé about measuring it in the past, and it's not clear. There's a little bit on wolves, but not a lot. And I suspect the main difference is what they're paying attention to, not their physiological ability, because physiologically they are pretty similar, but again, not a lot of research. But wolves are much more focused on scent than dog. So that may have an effect. What you're paying attention to does have an effect. And certainly I've also anecdotally noticed differences in dog breeds paying attention. So I had a line of shepherds who I was raising who were in a mind sniffing line of animals, and those dogs paid an annoying amount of attention to their noses compared to every other pup So I suspect there is some selection on that, which would be, again, not enough research, an interesting line somebody should do.
Yep. I've had different breeds, and a beagle is very nose oriented. All right. Another question from Robert Muller. Do you think there is a lot of variation between the development of wolf pups between different populations of wolves?
Yeah, so populations not so much, but there, as Cindy noted, with the differences in that development of fear, wolves compared to dogs are their variation is so much less. There's been so much selection there. It's really important for them to have that critical period just where it is, so that they can be as social as they are, but not like accidentally befriend a bear or something, because that would just be terrible. They'd just be selected out immediately. So I think that's been really, the variation on that's been really brought down. However, I will have one caveat to that. I did raise one litter of Arctic wolves, and there's only one litter, so I don't know if this was a real thing or just a fluke. But I've also heard it from other people who have raised wolf puppies that the Arctic wolves do tend to be weirdly more social. And so there is a possibility that something happened in the Arctic, the subspecies of Arctic wolves being so far removed. There's been, that whole island idea. If nobody's around, then sometimes things get more friendly. So it's possible that there's some extension there or something, but there's absolutely no research on it. So it's a complete anecdotal observation.
All right, a question from Evan James, who I think is EJ that I know. Does anyone know what the critical period for socialization is for young humans?
Yeah, there's been lots of research in kids. In fact, there's so much research in kids that it's hard to put it as simply as I have here in dogs, because really the critical period of socialization is a whole bunch of critical periods mashed together to kind of create this emergent effect that is the critical period of socialization. And in kids, we've gotten so into detail into every single little piece that this emergent effect is a little lost. But if we try to bring it, I'm going to forget the ages. The closest we can get to the avoidance of novelty is sort of when babies start to be like, you're not my mommy, and go like, oh, that's new and different. And there's a point before that where they're just like, everybody's yay. But it's really extended in kids. And then there's language development, which adds a whole nother critical period. So yes and no. We know so much that it's hard to simplify, I would say.
A question from Savvy Cornett. Hi, Savvy.
Hey, Savvy.
Are your experiments blind to sex of the individual animals?
Yeah, so I'm not sure which experiment she's talking about, but for the wolf hybrids, we put in the sex as a covariant, and it really doesn't seem to have any effect at all. So yeah, we when we're actually coding the behavior, we don't generally know. We're more worried about whether we know what percent wolf and dog they are when we're coding, but yeah.
And then I think this will be our last question because it's 1 o'clock. Just Robert Mueller is asking for information about articles and videos on the history of dog breed families. And actually, Robert, if this is the Robert Mueller that I know, I can make sure that you get Kathryn's, if you send me an email reminder, I'll make sure you get Kathryn's email. And Kathryn, I assume you'd be happy to answer about dog breed history.
Absolutely. We also, there's a chapter, if people are interested, and there's a chapter in Serple's republished book that I did with Ray on dog breeds and such as well, which I can't remember the name of right now, but it's James Serple wrote it, and it's the newest edition, and it's called like Dogs and something. I can't remember. If you look up James Serple dog book, it'll pop up.
All right, there are a couple more questions, but Karen, please let me know if there's a point where you want me to wrap up. I can keep going with questions.
I'm okay if you and Kathryn are okay.
I can do a few more.
You're good? Okay.
Okay, good. I'm okay too. Oh, these are going out of order. That's okay. So Phoebe Carcos asks, do you find more variation within litters of wolf pups or within litters of domestic dog pups? She says, I volunteer with foxhounds and we have a litter that makes up the main part of our pack. And there's so much variation between their behavior, appearance, athletic ability, scenting ability, drive, and even their cry. So variation within litters of wolf pups or variation within litters of domestic dogs? How do they?
Domestic dogs, no question. Absolutely domestic dogs. Ray used to say wolves are boring in comparison to dogs because there was so little variation. They still do vary, but they actually vary in kind of such a predictable way that I think it was Fox who wrote a paper on like the types of variation that you see within a litter. It's so stereotyped. It's like there's the bold one and the shy one and like there's so little variation compared to dogs, which are just all over the board. Yeah, no, it's definitely dogs.
Another question from Chelsea Chronic. Have you looked at eastern coyotes at all? Given they have around 20 to 25% wolf and domestic dog DNA, they might be a really interesting population to examine.
Yeah, the eastern coyotes are super cool. I have not, but yeah, they're really, I'd like to just try to figure out what the heck the coyote critical period is. I'm dying to know that. They're a mystery to me. But yeah, they're a very interesting population, and no, I have not gotten to. The closest that I got was we had a couple western coyotes at one of the sanctuaries we were at working with the hybrids. But
yeah, the eastern coyotes interest me as well because I run into them from time to time, and I'm from the Southwest, and in my mind, these are not coyotes, they are wolves.
They're very weird. They're very weird because they're the size. They're also talk about variation. Their size variation, the coat color variation, but that they all seem to kind of behave like coyotes as far as we can tell. They're very curious.
All right. Lindsay Lang asks, is there a concept of instinct that these critical period developments are modifying?
Okay, I'm not sure if I'm answering this the way you're asking it, but I would say that, so instinct, we generally don't use that word anymore. We tend to use the word intrinsic. And there are definitely, as far as intrinsic behaviors, that sort of remodeling of adult behavior I was hinting at the beginning that happens during the critical period. There are things called motor patterns, which are units of behavior. And when a baby mammal is born, like a dog pup or a wolf pup, they have a very rigid set of behaviors that kind of shows up with them. They have to have suckling and things like that, rooting and all sorts of good foraging behaviors that are ready to go, but then they have to shift it into their adult behaviors. And so we see this kind of metamorphosis where those motor patterns from the newborn start to die out, and these motor patterns for the adults start to pop up, and they pop up perfectly formed. But so things like the foraging behavior for wolves is made up of a number of motor patterns, and those motor patterns show up perfectly, but the context they're in, the sequencing they go into, the threshold at which they start being showed, you know, how much stimulus is needed to get one to start, all of that develops during the critical period. So it's this really interesting mix of this intrinsic motor pattern with the developmental environment. And I did another part of my dissertation on that. That was what all that kestrel stuff was about. So it's a super interesting area where you get this mix of intrinsic and development.
All right, I think this is our last question. Ingrid Sweeney asks, if you went back to the guide dog population today, what advice would you have for their puppy raisers and their trainers?
So I have, actually, because suddenly my current lab is working in a working dog project, and we're working with a bunch of guide dog institutions. And so I'm telling them exactly what I told them 20 years ago. But yeah, it's all about, so before the puppy raisers, it's all about getting them used to novelty in every way possible, in as positive a way possible, as well as allowing for quality of sleep and stuff like that. I've done a number of talks for guide dog places and puppy raisers on this topic, but if you actually provide enough positive novel experience during the critical period, it's possible, especially with something with a slightly longer critical period like a lab, it's possible to get them to not be scared of novelty, which is really the goal for a guide dog. And also to be well enough socialized with humans and not overly socialized with dogs. So they're more interested in their humans than their dog puppies. And then for dog raisers, it gets into that 16-week thing, right? Getting them over anything that was missed, making it familiar in that initial period before they hit 16 weeks, so that they can explore anything that they missed out on when they were in the kennels. That's the really short version of it. But yeah, there's a lot of cool stuff still to be done in the guide dog world and assistance dog world, but guide dog's the hardest.
Ken Rosenthal says that the seeing eye has been grateful for your advice. Okay, I'm going to hand this back to Karen, and Kathryn, if you want to stop sharing your slides, that's fine.
Yeah, let's do that.
And thank you, Kathryn, very much. I enjoyed it and knew that I would. It's got more ideas in my head. Karen, you're up.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Kathryn and Cindy, for moderating. I love that part about the complicated path. We thought it was going to be a straight line from loving animals, but I think we all at Hampshire probably agree that there is a common thread in the end that gets us to the same goal. And there were so many great questions. Thanks for sticking around and answering them.